I want you to tell me, from your point of view, how you helped them to develop a remedy that would work and would be culturally sensitive for that area. What did you do?
I think we need to go back a bit. Earlier on, the others, I think it was Bernadette from Cardno who said, who is we referring to in the community, and to what extent do we mean a community? What is a community? Because the women Barrack is talking about are not local women. They're women who have come from other provinces to be there. The local women also affected, but there are also women from other provinces who came. Because we know that where there is money and men are there with money, women will come too. And so it's not so easy to fault. And somebody also said that there are 3 in the marriage when it comes to companies getting involved, because our government too do not have in place policies and legislations that would help guide companies what to do in country. So those sort of things are absent. Like, we don't, correct me, Patrick, and them, like, our government don't even have children protection policy. What would guide companies coming to do that? So getting back to your question of when these things happen, we know in country that trafficking of women locally is a big problem. But we didn't know the extent of the problem at Porgera until other people started talking about it. And also, we don't have the resources to reach out to where the mines are, what donors give to us, because we don't get government support for what we do. So when this opportunity came by Barrick, it gave us a chance to step in to help to do what we always wanted to do in that area of where mines are. And so they opened the door for us to come in, and the consultation was very wide. Men came from both Papua New Guineans, and international experts who have been working in Papua New Guinea were involved in developing the program with Barrick.
And you feel very much that you were able to listen to the voices of the women and understand through that process, and that you were able to, on their behalf, really be an architect of this remedy program. Is that right?
Very much so, because I was up at Porgera, was it last month? And I was there for a week. And one thing that was not a week ago, when was that we had the international NGOs who came, and they accused us of just doing what Barrick is telling us. And we told them, no, this is ours. We have worked with them to develop this thing the way we want it. And that's what we are implementing. And I'm not defending Barrick, but that's what we exactly did. We worked with Barrick and Cardno, who were there also, to put something in place we thought was relevant and appropriate for our women.
Now, this is interesting because you know, and Patrick touched on it, and you talked about your own personal disappointment that this happened. So essentially, an NGO came in and said, that's not compensation, that's not how you do compensation, that's all wrong. You've got that wrong, and the mining company's been exploitative. And we've seen, you know, very obviously that the lengths that everybody went to ensure that it was an appropriate, response. What didn't the NGO understand about women in the Porgera Valley, regardless of where they're from?
One thing, and I'm sad to say this to many of you who are so-called experts seated here, is that you don't recognize us also as experts in our own country. Most times you come to tell us what to do, when we know ourselves what we need to do. I am getting emotional because that seemed to be the story in Papua New Guinea. And so these people who came forget that our situation in PNG, our rights to realize, is determined by the situation we are in.
And so I'll talk so that you can...
Yeah, so like you may have the right to walk down this street at night, but if you're in Port Moresby, that right you cannot exercise because it is not safe. That's what I'm talking about. You cannot go giving cash, huge cash to women, knowing that women are not going to use that money. Many of you who have worked in Papua New Guinea know that the husbands, the brothers, the cousins will take that money. So in this remedial package, we had to look at ways that we think our women would properly benefit from. For instance, many of our women who got raped are stealing, and we have to think of ways we can give them something that they can do now. We talk about education. Our women are educated in wherever they have been taught to survive. They make gardens, they look after pigs, they look after chicken. And so what we were doing is taking advantage of that education. As I explained to them when I was up there last time, I said to them, you are educated, but we say you are uneducated because you're not literate. And giving you literacy means enabling you to go to the banks, to access and to read things that you're not able to have information that can readily be available to you.
So for you, that was how to build a remedy, was to offer somebody a way to build their build on what they have, build their self-esteem.
Yes.
Because that's where the damage had happened.
Yes.
And so finally on this point, we'll come to the rest of the panel, but it's a fascinating point. So you wrote a very impassioned letter to UNHCR saying, you know, don't listen to this, because the argument that had come from this NGO was that the package that you all had put together does not meet international human rights criteria, and that the packages offered were not rights compatible. So I guess that's what you're dealing with as well in all of this.
Right.
Is that other element of how this is all viewed with the company and the women in the middle of it all. And that's the reality, isn't it?
In reality, when you get raped in Papua New Guinea and there is compensation to pay, the highest amount paid is 100 kina. I came here and I changed 600 kina and I got only 200 kina, 200 Australian dollars. So 100 kina, what's that in Australian dollars? That is what is paid in compensation to a rape victim. So to talk about giving huge sums of money to our rape victims was not the right way to go to address this thing, because our men would have access to that money.
Thank you very much, Ume, for telling us all of that. That was a difficult thing to do, and we thank you. Please thank Ume for that, just at this point of the panel. And I think it does sort of make the point, doesn't it, that Barrack thought they were listening and thought they had done what they needed to do, but they hadn't heard what they needed to hear. And you know, all of the things that have to come together to get true community engagement, and in this case in a crisis situation. Ron, I want to come to you. You've worked extensively in PNG for mining companies and for the national government. And you write in your briefing notes for me in a sort of anguished way about, gee, this is a difficult issue, but you know what, we can't be involved in social engineering. What did you mean when you wrote that for me?
I think what I was trying to get at there was, as a mining company, we have a very limited remit and ability to try and go into people's lives and tell them how to live those lives because of who and what we are, which is not to say that people don't need help, but my sense of it is we need to partner and work with people such as Ume and other institutions, perhaps NGO groups, local NGO groups, to facilitate the dialogue necessary. But if the company is seen in these contexts as the bringer of all things good and all things evil, we come in the orange shirt, if you like, whether we're wearing it or not. So I've always felt uncomfortable when international conventions say the company should be pushing this way, pushing that way, and we don't really have any sort of moral or legal remit to get too deep into people's lives. We can be aware of the problems that Ume's found. PNG is a very violent society. It's still emerging and growing and working out ways to deal with that. So we have to work our way through that together, but we're not in a position to stand up in front of an audience in a community and preach to them that they should follow the way we think they should be living their lives either. So it's a delicate balance between trying to facilitate things happening and putting yourself in a position where you're actually trying to dictate to people what should be appropriate for them.
Isn't the risk of that approach, though, that you say, I've listened to Ume and I cannot be too proactive in this environment because I will blunder around in a culture I don't fully understand, even though I've listened. Isn't the risk that you take with that, and therefore I won't, even though I'm an agent for change, by my very presence, I won't act as an agent for change here. I won't do it. I'll just press pause.
I think that's a fair summation of pretty much industry attitudes in the past.
Is that acceptable?
No, but because we were easily able to put it in the too hard basket on that context or on that pretext, I think certainly now with the focus that comes out, terrible things like what happened at Porgera help us all sharpen our focus and say, if we're not more proactive in this space, we could find ourselves in the same situation. These things can emerge around you. So the challenge for us, I think, is to find appropriate ways to deal with these things, not assuming that we, the company, can in and of ourselves resolve them, but pick up from the learnings and the things that Ume's been saying. There are national institutions. To what extent have we actually engaged with them? And I'm not saying we have done that yet. That's my position, my feeling, that that's where we need to move to facilitate a process rather than think it's up to us to solve it.
And just before we leave you, Ron, while we're in the mea culpa space, you've had experience of, well, your company's had experience of trying to do this, of trying to advocate for women's rights, and it kind of, it sort of blew up in your face. It didn't really work. Tell us what happened and why, and what you figured out from that. Gee, thanks,
in simple terms, it was well-meaning efforts to promote women, this was on the Lihir Island project, into business ventures, and without really thinking it through, I guess we thought this sounds like a good idea, so we promoted a business venture. It was actually a can crushing recycling business, and the synergies seemed fine to us. The men drink all the beer, the women get the brunt of that, so maybe if we set up a business recycling the beer cans, they could make some money and there'd be some sort of balance there. But it became quite a successful little business, albeit in a small way. But then the men became jealous of that business, interfered in it, drove it to the point where eventually they took over the business, and within a few months the business went belly up. So the point of it being, when we are trying to make these interventions empower women, help them out if you like, we have to be careful we don't put them even inadvertently in a situation where they're in conflict with the men. On Lihir and through most of PNG, men see business as men's business. So if a woman or a women's group makes a successful business, there's a pushback and a jealousy factor. So we need to find more strategic methods of empowering women without thrusting them or encouraging them to get into situations where they might find themselves in conflict with male aspirations.
Margaret, can I have your reflections on all this conversation so far?
Yes, I think I'd like to go back to one of the points that Ume mentioned earlier on when she said that, we don't have a government that has services in place for their citizens, and the research that I've done looked at the financial flows from companies in Papua New Guinea to governments, to development trusts and to communities. And as we heard earlier, community programs for most companies are really tiny compared with the huge amounts of sums that get paid in royalties and taxes. And to some extent, companies pay those very willingly because partly they expect that government will accept responsibility to remediate some of the disadvantages and some of the damage done by mining companies' operations. In a country like Papua New Guinea, companies know full well when they go in that governments don't have the capacity to remediate most of the problems that are going to arise. And if they have the capacity, they usually don't have the commitment. So they go in knowing full well that there will not be remediation and there will not be services delivered to people as a result of these huge taxes they're paying to governments, both national and provincial. So I guess it leaves me with the question of how do companies reconcile this? You know, what kind of discussions do they have in their board? How do they think about this problem? Because when you have a negotiation with a community, when a company does all the kinds of negotiations that we've been hearing about early on, and all of that is best practice and is to be applauded, in fact, the only people around the table who know exactly what will happen as a result of the mine coming to an area is the company. The other people, the communities expect riches of some sort to flow their way, but they don't really know until company operations start what the damage is going to be. The politicians, the bureaucrats in the room see revenue flowing their way. They also see potential for infrastructure development and business opportunities, but they don't know the full picture either. So it seems to me that there needs to be, with the last panel was discussing this, there needs to be this, you can't just rule a line under the negotiations and say, you know, we've decided, you know, what companies will, what their relationship is with the communities and what benefits are going to flow. That needs to be just constantly revisited because people's understanding of what the effects are develop over time, and it will become more clear to perhaps women in communities likely here after the men get used to them having a little bit of income, how they could actually improve their position as societal change takes place. But it just seems to me that there are some really major, I would say almost moral issues for companies, because they do know that they're going to change a society and a dynamic greatly, and the work that they do through their community programs can go some way to remediate that, but it's really tiny compared with the scale of the efforts required. So I think it's a conundrum, and I'm kind of interested to know how companies think about that issue.
I'd be interested to hear that, but it's interesting what you're saying, because you're talking about known knowns. You know, in certain countries that, you know, the benefits won't trickle down to the local community. And the case study we've just had is, perhaps from Ume's point of view, a known unknown, but from Barrick's point of view after its listing was an unknown unknown, if you see my point. Marco, if I can come to you, you've spent a lot of time in sub-Saharan Africa. What, in that area of the unknown where you think you're doing the right thing, you think you're operating in a way where you're listening to community, have you got some sense after years of doing this of when you know something won't work, when you know that the company has inadvertently, in its relations with community, kind of concreted in fault lines?
Probably, yes. I think the only real known there is that as a company you don't know what the upheaval is going to be that you cause. So you know there's going to be upheaval, you know that you're going to cause profound changes in the communities that you're affecting. What those changes are exactly, you do not know. At the same time, I think Margaret is very much right, that you do know that probably the revenue that you're sending off to the central government isn't going to make it back. You may know that even if it doesn't make back, the local government probably won't be able to handle it. So what you really need to do is engage in a two-way conversation, I think, in which you're, as a company, and the NGOs and the consultants around you are honest towards the communities as to what the company actually can provide and is planning on doing in the next couple of years. And at the same time, use that process through FPIC, through ESAA, to really listen to the communities and hear their concerns and answer their questions, and make sure that they understand that you do not understand their local culture and their local communities and exactly what the changes are and what the needs and the challenges might be going forward.
So what's your experience in terms of how to listen when you're not sure how to hear? Yeah?
Engage in a process. You have compliance regulatory processes you need to go through. There are a lot of international best practices. There's IFC performance standards, there's ICMM guidelines. There's a whole lot of stuff out there. I think what it all comes down to, and probably the one common characteristic that they have, is stakeholder engagement and community outreach and engaging in that dialogue. So that's what it all comes down to. I don't think up front you can say you need to do this and you absolutely shouldn't do that. What you need to do is engage in the dialogue and try to come up with solutions that fit the local context and that fit the communities that you're dealing with.
Ron, do you want to reflect on what Margaret had to say?
Yeah, I think for mine, it comes down to the learnings of the last 20 years, certainly for myself, that 20, 25 years ago, social impact assessment wasn't much of a science. Nowadays, we have a much greater appreciation of the value of doing your homework. So you can't predict with certainty what the future is, but you certainly know, as Margaret says, that you bring a major mining operation into a remote rural area where people have been subsistence farmers, then they're on a hell of a roller coaster ride for the rest of their lives. I first turned up on here in 1990 when there was just an exploration camp there. Go there now and it's hard to recognise the place. I sometimes wonder the people who actually lived through that have had to cater and deal with a lot of things. So it's no wonder you get a lot of community stress that you have to deal with. They have aspirations. When we signed the original agreements to kickstart the mine, those guys didn't have any real idea where they were going. They have a much better idea now. Same for the company. What you find in our business is you get different populations of people working on a project through pre-feasibility, full feasibility, construction, and then operations. So you're changing people in and out, so you don't necessarily have a real continuity of involvement other than generally in the community space. So, sorry, I'm rambling around a bit, but I think the answer is do your homework, utilise all those tools that Marco was just talking about, utilise institutions such as the Centre for Socially Responsible Mining, which has been around for 10 years now. There are tools and resources and people we can call upon now to inform our own awareness. So there's no real excuse for saying, oh, didn't see that coming. And things will always happen out of the blue, but context is important. To keep the word that kept recurring to me listening to the Barrick story. Part of the context there was when they started the mine, there were about 4,000 people living in and around the mine. Now there are 50,000 people. Now that's a lot of people to try and keep an eye on, if you will. That's a big challenge. And maybe they didn't try hard enough at the time, but it's easy to say that sitting up here and from this distance. So I think we're getting better at it. We certainly are conscious of the fact that government has limited capability to come to the table to deliver what it should be delivering. But that sort of brings us to Bruce's point. If we take on the role of government, become agents of community development, how do we hand that mantle back to government? How do we transfer the necessary skills, knowledge and resources to a local level government? And this is the thing I wrestle with a lot. Capacity building, empowering these agencies is a lot easier to say than to actually bring about.
Ume, I want to come back to you, and there's just 2 points for the panel, I think, before we go to panel discussion, for questions from the audience. The first idea I want to ask you is what kind of investments do you think are required to listen and to really understand? Like what do you think needs to be done to do that? what sorts of investments, what do you have to do you think, in Papua New Guinea to listen and really understand when you're going into an area or you're trying to deal with a problem that's emerged for an existing project? What do you have to do?
This in relation to voices not heard. One that's very clear is companies all have public relations offices. And the nationals employed there don't seem to know what they, like most times they're there really trying to make things good for company, not really engaging with the people to bring tangible development for people. But I understand that that's probably not company's role to do that, but then who else will do it if you're the only one there? And the other thing that I see there is like I said, who is the community? It's one thing to talk about where the mine site is and the problems surrounding the people there. It's another thing to talk about the extended impact of the mine on the other people who are now being part of it, like where the roads have gone, where people are coming from to seek jobs. All these things, usually we don't take these things into consideration when we are looking at the opening of the mine. The unskilled people who are flocking in, leaving women and children behind. All these things. It's a whole range of social problems that are created, and company alone cannot do it. We need to look at governments to put in place, like I said before, proper programs and policies, legislations. I don't know what else. I really don't have answer, but I know national governments need to take ownership and do something about it.
And the other question I have is, a lot of what we've been talking about today is, the idea is, how do you ensure that when a resource project goes ahead, there is development in the future, there's a payoff for that local community long term? How do you do that? Okay, and then now come back and say, okay, well, we know that on the downside we can muck this up if we don't understand the existing social environment, the place of women in this environment and so forth. What do you think is the role of a mining company? Should they be pushing to develop the role of women? Should they be pushing to make life better for women, to change the status of women in PNG society, or is that not their role?
Since we started working on the remedial program at Pogera, a couple of things I have noticed. Through that program, women's dressing have changed. They now dress better. I don't know what happened, but they're dressing better. The number of girls at the vocational school has increased. Just taking an interest in them and talking to them, the CAT team talking to them about their rights, how they should clean themselves before they go somewhere, things like that. And the interest I've seen by women, young women who want, even with 2 children, want to go back to school because government is now offering free education, and through this remedial program, school fees are being offered to those who want to go back to school. And so women with, and like CAT counselors were telling me how husband comes in and they talk together for him to understand that she wants to go back to school. And these are things we don't hear about in this place. It's just male-dominated. And for such impact, to take an interest, maybe not to do anything, whatever, but to take interest. Do we have targets have we set ourselves goals as company, what we want to achieve for the people, apart from extracting things out, the resources out? Is there something you want to look back and say, this is what I've achieved while I was there? I didn't just take copper out. This is what I've left behind. This is how many women we have educated. These are the number of people who have gone to university because we were there. Those are sort of things we need to ask ourselves whether it is just government responsibility or does companies have a part to play?
So on the one hand, you're saying, we heard Salim Ali say before, in terms of transparency, which is a different issue. Yes, you can be transparent, but that in itself may cause conflict. And he says that might be constructive conflict. Your advice was it's not constructive conflict to pay compensation such as you would in a developed country to women. That's not constructive. But you're saying don't lack ambition in terms of trying to affect lives.
Right.
Is that right?
I think, if I may, I think what it comes down to, it's not the role of a company to push anything. Again, you can...
It's not the role of the company to push
I don't think
anything.
not to push it, no, because again, you cannot know what you're setting in effect. I do think what a company can provide is options and choices. And I think this illustrates that very well. Women have the option to do literacy programs, give youth, unemployed youth, the option to set up a small business with a loan. I think that's somewhere where a company can come in and make a real difference for the long term.
I want to come to questions from the floor. I also want to hear, Margaret, about your research. You talk away, Margaret. I'll winkle out some questions.
Okay. I just wanted to hark back to a comment Andrew Buckley made this morning. He says there's a growing commitment of companies to drive development outcomes. I wrote it down because I wanted to say something about it. If there is a growing commitment to drive development outcomes, we don't know what they are. Because if you look at company reporting, and I've done detailed studies on companies' responsibility and sustainability reports, you have measures of everything they wanted to achieve in the environmental area where they save, it's good savings for them in terms of their costs, and there are fine international measures of what success looks like. But when you look at their social programs, very few companies publish any kinds of goals or targets, and they certainly don't report consistently from one year to the next. This year, this many children in this area were inoculated. We were part of the provincial program for vaccinations. Next year, this many. You can't track any development outcomes, things that would be recognised as development outcomes. You cannot track that through company reporting. You can, if you try really hard, you can get consistent numbers from year to year on how much they spend on particular things, but spending is not a development outcome. So I think there is tremendous potential for companies to start shining a light on the area in which they operate and say, when we started in this area, these are some of the indicators for education, health, women's enterprise, rural roads that are being maintained, and then track that each year. Are things improving or aren't they?
Well, if the superannuation trustees asked them to do it, they'd do it, wouldn't they? I mean, if the investors asked them to do it, they'd do it.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's in that kind of regular tracking is actually in the GRI framework, but I haven't seen a company yet that does it and publishes it. And I think it could be tremendously powerful, not just for the companies, but it means that you can translate that information through to communities. And you can say that, when we started out on this program, we had a partnership with the local government, the Department of Health, and ourselves, and maybe an aid donor, and together we were going to work to achieve certain improvements in health. Last year we were able to achieve so much, but this party unfortunately didn't deliver on its part of the bargain, and this one did twice as much as it anticipated. So I know that's a crude way of putting it, but if you actually, if companies were establishing long-term programs to achieve development outcomes, they have to do it in partnership. No one's expecting companies to do it alone, and it's not going to leave any legacy anyway or any durability if they do it alone. But if they could find some way of shining a light to improve transparency and accountability for the benefits that are supposed to flow, are anticipated to flow from mining projects, then I think that, you could really, that could be a very powerful thing for companies to do.
Patrick, if you...
I just want to respond to Margaret's earlier point about who best can predict the impact of a mining operation. I think there's a difference between, again, historical mines still in operation and that were built under and developed under a different conceptual framework, if you like, and new mines and mines that are on the kind of planning table now. But just to use the Porgera example, Ron touched on the population increase. It's actually 60,000, not 50, so it's even more extreme than we thought. The original mine development contract was predicated on a population rise to about 20,000. So the infrastructure that was put in to mitigate, if you like, that population increase and the impact that would bring was well out. You know, it was a third of what it ended up being. And we actually went through a process about 5 years ago now with the state to renegotiate, I guess, the infrastructure, recognising that particularly in the law and justice sector, it just wasn't coping, and that there was rampant lawlessness and all of the attendant social impacts that come with that. And the state was operating something called the tax credit scheme, which allowed for a percentage of mine revenues to be allocated towards public sector infrastructure development. They were reluctant to go it alone, and they wanted to see some skin on the table from the company. So we also put money on the table, and for 3 years ran an infrastructure development program using tax credit scheme money from the government and money from the company to build the law and justice sector infrastructure, so courthouses and police stations and barracks to even house the numbers of police that were needed through the policing number formula and other things. And 3 years later, we delivered the keys to all of that new infrastructure. But the one thing that a company can't do is employ police officers, magistrates, judges, and others. And unfortunately, the sad reality is that some of those buildings stay empty. There was a temporary increase in the number of police who 6 months later, a large proportion of whom decided that they didn't actually like the place very much and left, contrary to their orders. So you can see the company at that point was trying to stand up and say, we all got it wrong. The impact is much greater than we thought. The population is much greater than we thought it would be. What do we do? And did what it could to facilitate developing that, in particular, that public sector infrastructure. But there's still a great weakness there from one party in terms of how you staff it and manage it.
Mm. Do you want to, as Tony Jones would say, take that as a comment?
Yeah, it's just really hard when you've got a state that delivers so little, as the PNG state does.
Comment.
Thank you. Serena Lillywhite from Oxfam. A question for Ume and perhaps you also, Patrick. Just to commend Barrick on establishing a local level grievance mechanism. This is certainly part of the framework that Oxfam recommends for good governance, and also to acknowledge the work being done with Ume to make sure that the remedies are not just cash handouts. Oxfam was one of the organisations that expressed some concern with this mechanism, and there was one element of the mechanism that we had some concerns about, and that was a requirement that those individuals who were seeking remedy would sign a waiver that they would not pursue any further legal action against Barrick, either within PNG or outside of PNG. And I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about the rationale for including that legal indemnity waiver, if you like, in the framework, and if you think, Ume, the women concerned fully understood what that might mean to sign that indemnity.
Patrick, you want to answer it or answer?
Well, you go first.
Okay. The matter was brought up end of January when I was up there, and we said, doesn't really have any strong whatever. I mean, down the line, after the woman received all these things from this remedial package, maybe 10 years later, she might go to court and say they forced me to sign. I mean, it's there. I agree. It's there for them to sign, and they sign, and they have access to this thing. They don't even have to sign for them to receive health checks and counseling. But we only allowed that also for them to sign the agreement was because we need to make sure that our women are not taking advantage of, not abusing the process. Because like you saw Patrick and Joshua. Josh's presentation that we did have some women who came who were not telling truth about what happened to them. So, but you know, like I said, with the signing, it probably won't. It's not that watertight. Women probably further down the years will say, "I was forced to sign," and can take people to court. I don't know, but that's how I see it, and I was explaining to them that this shouldn't stop you from signing to receive what is rightfully yours to get. Patrick, you want to say something?
Sure. Look, just to respond from the company's perspective, it actually was a big debate internally. It was a big debate. There was one school of thought that said if the remedy is sufficient and appropriate and acceptable and in part designed by the claimant, there's no risk of future litigation, and we don't need a waiver. Another argument, which came predominantly from our legal group, said this is no different to an out-of-court settlement. These are civil reparations, and as you would in an out-of-court settlement, you sign an agreement saying that that's the end of the matter. Having said that, when the criticisms were first raised, they came they dealt with a number of factors. One was that question of civil damages versus reparations. But others were more pointed, and people were concerned that the legal waiver was overly broad, and that certain types of remedy shouldn't be contingent on that signing. So as Umo said, health services and welfare services, psychosocial counselling, trauma counselling, these things were actually provided without a need to sign a final settlement. And also we narrowed the scope of the wording of that settlement so that it specifically excluded things like being sued for criminal negligence or anything that was a criminal act rather than relating directly to civil damages. So we certainly took account of the views that were coming to us. We made improvements where we could, but at the end of the day, the corporate decision was, as it is similar to an out-of-court settlement, we'll include that waiver.
Now, are there any other questions before we draw this this panel to a close? Anyone else I'm cutting off in the room? No? Please thank the members of this panel very much. Thank you.